Hello, everybody. This is Ethan with WiseCrack Studios, and today I wanted to talk about arranging, probably one of the most important things for having a good mix. Now, if you've watched this channel for any period of time, you probably know that I'm a huge fan of the idea that the kinds of instruments that you use, as well as where they are located within the mix, make a much bigger difference than, say, a single notch on an EQ. Now, where am I going with this? I'm going here with all of this. Right now, I've got set up a single person chorus. We recorded the same person singing different parts over and over and over again. I think there's about 18 parts here. Now let's go ahead and listen to this in context, and I want for you to think about what you're hearing. Now, what we're hearing here is actually a little trick that I know of because of many years in choirs that I spent, where especially men's choirs tend to do this. You separate all of the individual members of the choir based on what kind of part they are doing, so that you have it set up so that no two people that are standing next to each other are doing the same part. It helps to blend the entire thing together a little bit more easily before it even reaches the audience, so then whenever it goes into the big auditorium, it's already blended, as opposed to having it set up to where it hits the audience and I can think, okay, there's the basses, there's the tenors, etc., etc. So what I actually did for this was I went through and I individually mapped all of the different parts one by one so that none of them are really sitting in the same spot. I know the hard left and right are going to be similar, but that's because they're hard left and hard right. Overall, it leaves it so that it's not really sitting on top of itself too bad, and even if you listen, you can hear the tenor part stick out a little bit better, but it's a nice warm tenor, and then you have the bass part that's reinforcing the actual bass guitar. So let's go ahead and listen to that without the rest of that. This is a part that I could actually very easily see being recorded in this sort of style with an actual choral group, where it's just sort of a bass and a tenor part, and you have it set up so that the choir is bass, tenor, bass, tenor, bass, tenor, so that it never quite melds together into sections so much as it melds together into a sound. Now, sort of the inverse of that last idea is what I have set up with all of the various strings and brass in this song. Now, the close of this song is going to be a very big, bombastic number, and I wanted it to be very over the top by effectively throwing in a symphonic orchestra. Now, I don't have the money to purchase the time of a symphonic orchestra, as I'm sure you do not, so I ended up just using a whole bunch of MIDI instruments. I've made videos about how to make those sound more realistic, and I'm sure I'll make plenty more. But one thing that I had to work with is panning decisions. Now, originally I did a pretty similar idea of what I normally would do, setting up the panning for a song like this, where I just have cellos are going to be the low instrument, violas are on the right, violin 2s are on the left, and violin 1s are back in the center, just on top of the cellos. I did a pretty similar idea for the brass instruments of trombone in the middle, tenor and alto sax on left and right respectively, and trumpet 2 and trumpet 1 were both down the center, just sitting on top of that trombone section. That actually really did not work. Now, on paper, it seems like a good idea, but there was something that I wasn't thinking about, and it's the fact that all of them together were just sort of meshing together into a weird sound that didn't really have a lot of definition. Really, the only instrument that you could tell what it was for the most part was the trumpet 1s, and they were because they had the main melody part out of all of the brass, and brass is just naturally louder than strings. Now, my choices were effectively either to let it stay like that, or go back to the drawing board and try to figure out what was wrong with what I was doing. And what I ended up figuring out was actually pretty simple of a mistake. If I actually did hire a symphonic orchestra, one of the easiest things I could do to record them is just put up 2 stereo mics and just let them do their thing. Now, something that you don't think about when you're in the recording studio is symphonic orchestras have placements that they do for all of their instruments. You don't have a trumpet hanging out with the violins just in the middle of their area, etc., etc. You might have, like, the trombones are sitting next to the cellos in the back, but you don't have that much crossover between the individual instruments and their sections. They're together in one section, and then they're together in a different section, instrument by instrument. And what I was doing was effectively trying to use the same arranging strategy that I had done before with the choir, and I was trying to apply it to a symphonic orchestra, and that just does not work for similar reasons. Where for a choir, it can hit you as a wall of sound, and it's a good thing. If it's a symphonic orchestra, the instruments aren't going to blend together as easily, as well as that the ones that are just naturally louder are going to stick out as opposed to sitting on top of everything else. Whereas the ones that don't naturally stick out as much, such as the cello or the viola, are just going to be gone. You will not hear them. So let's go ahead and take a listen to this idea. Let's go ahead and listen to how this sounds good. Now, especially as this is like this, you can hear even the individual trumpet parts, which is a huge deal compared to before, because I had to work so hard to try to get them to stick out. And now they don't necessarily stick out so much as they're just sitting on top of the rest of the brass section. It sounds a little bit more at this point like I went to a symphonic orchestra, put a couple of microphones towards the back of their hall, and just recorded them play, as opposed to before, where it sounded like I individually mic'd all of the different instruments and then had them going right down center. Now, all of that is compared to this original version, where, again, I went through and I sort of panned everything the way that I normally would for these individual sections without thinking about the fact that I had them both together. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and play this and try to see how many individual parts you can pick out. And go ahead and leave that number in the comments, because I kind of want to see what you think. Now, personally, I can't hear nearly as many parts as I could hear before. I can hear that there are strings there, but more or less I can only hear the trumpet ones, kind of the trumpet twos, but it's blending together with most of the rest of the brass. Overall, it's set up in a way where each of the brass instruments, just by nature of them being brass instruments, are sitting on top of all of the other string instruments, to where you can't really tell what's going on outside of the trumpets. Now, for a brass band, that would be great. You have whatever instrument is taking the melody, in this case it's the trumpet, and you have everything else that's sort of accompanying it. For a string section, typically you would have more movement in treble instruments and not as much movement in bass instruments, which leads to them just sort of sitting there. But because of how it's arranged, I can't hear any of that. It's just kind of a big ball of sound that, again, I can't really even tell that the strings are there. Outside of this time, I did notice that violin twos were a little louder than I would have wanted them to be for balance purposes, but they were the only string instruments I could distinctly hear. So hopefully I've just given you an idea that you can work with in the future on your own music. Go ahead and leave a comment down below if you have any ideas of things that you would like for me to talk about in the future. Please give this video a like if you want to hear me talk more about arranging and how it's important. Little things like this help me to just know what you guys want to see and build the channel into something a little bit better every day. So hopefully I've just given you something that you can mess around with in the future. As for me, this has been Ethan with WiseCrack Studios, and I hope that you have a lovely day.